week, where just a couple weeks ago we announced we were going to do all pre-recorded, and then here 2 weeks later we've pulled a fast one on them to go give them the opportunity to go live again. But I think there's a pretty good reason for that, which is that our all-star, all-time favorite closing bell guest is back on to teach us some more stuff. You want to introduce her, Trey?
Well, I mean, you don't need to introduce the A team. It's like, you know, I mean, the NBA is starting back up, and nobody ever asked Scottie Pippen to introduce Michael Jordan. So here we are. But we've got Felicia Wu on. Felicia's going to be talking to us about the developments in vaccines. You know, obviously Felicia's kind of needs no introduction at Michigan State University, but really we're thrilled to have you back on, because the first two times that we had you on and early in the pandemic, when we were just trying to make things up as we went, you were fortunately on while we were talking things through, and you helped us answer those questions. So thrilled to have you back to answer some of the bigger questions on with regard to the vaccine.
Well, thank you, Trey and Alex. I'm happy to join you again and to answer your questions and any audience questions related to the COVID-19 vaccines.
So then should we just start with an overview? I know we had you on in, I believe it was May, to talk exactly about this issue, the probability of a vaccine. And if I remember correctly, Felicia, you said there were something like 70 vaccines being potentially developed. Obviously, that has changed tremendously now, and that we've seen in the last few weeks some claims about efficacy in the stage 3 trials for a few of them. And then even maybe yesterday, we saw that the Pfizer vaccine was authorized in England or the UK. Maybe could you give us sort of a broad overview of where we're at in vaccine development, the testing, and then the authorization process?
Absolutely. Well, the first thing I want to share is that this is all very good news, and it's amazing the speed at which these vaccines have been developed and the process by which they might have the potential to be authorized for emergency use. So I just want to start out with a huge thank you to all of the developers of these vaccines and all of the individuals who volunteered for these phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 clinical trials, as well as all the healthcare workers who are just overwhelmed with caring for all of the COVID-19 patients in these days. So it looks as though there is a light at the end of the tunnel. We are nearing the possibility of emergency use authorization for at least 2 vaccines in the near future. First, Alex, you were asking about the number of different vaccines that are in various different stages of development. Right now, there are a total of 78 vaccines that are either in phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, or limited or emergency authorization use. And there's about another 80 that are in preclinical trials. So they're being tested for safety and efficacy in animals. There's just a huge, huge number. So about 158 to 160 total around the world right now. And the good news is that recently we have received notice of the phase 3, that is the large studies that involve tens of thousands of human volunteers. We have some of the data for their clinical trials, and these are with the vaccines developed by Pfizer and BioNTech, Moderna, and Oxford and AstraZeneca. So 3 different vaccines, and they are showing quite good rates of safety and efficacy. In fact, the levels of efficacy are really wonderful, and Dr. Anthony Fauci just earlier this week, I think he referred to it as astounding, just amazing results of efficacy, upwards of like 94 to 95% efficacy for the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines.
And Felicia, can you tell us how exactly have they arrived at those numbers? I believe I believe the claim was something like 95%, but it's not like a standard control trial where we're gonna give people placebo and treatment, and then they're gonna infect a whole bunch of people with coronavirus to figure out which of them have symptoms and not, right? How does this work that they arrive at these numbers?
Sure, I'd be glad to explain that. And I'll be focusing on the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines in these cases. So the Pfizer phase 3 clinical trial involved about 44,000 human volunteers. And what had happened was that they randomized the volunteers into either receiving the Pfizer and BioNTech vaccine or a placebo vaccine. So they received the first vaccine, and then 3 weeks later, they received a booster shot. And um, both for the Pfizer and the Moderna phase 3 clinical trials, they were deliberately trying to recruit people in what were called COVID-19 hotspots, so that there would already be some natural risk of their just going out into their environment and contracting COVID-19. And in fact, that is what happened. Um, in the case of the Pfizer phase 3 clinical trial, what had happened was that 170 of the volunteers actually did contract COVID-19. And 162 of them were in the placebo group, and only 8 were in the vaccine group. Furthermore, of those 170 individuals who did contract COVID-19, there were 10 severe COVID-19 cases, and 1 of them occurred in the vaccine group, whereas 9 occurred in the control group. So that was how they had arrived at their estimates as far as the efficacy of the vaccine. With the Moderna trial, so that involved between 30,000 to 33,000 volunteers. And in that case, 196 of the volunteers became ill with COVID-19. And 185 of them were in the placebo group, and only 11 were in the vaccinated group. And of the 11 in the vaccinated group, not a single one had severe COVID-19, meaning that none of them had to go to the hospital. They just recovered on their own. And that's why you might have seen the good news about where I think there was like Science Magazine had an article just a few days ago stating that the Moderna vaccine showed 100% efficacy against severe COVID-19 based on the phase 3 clinical trial results.
To just from a nerdy statistical point of view, to how certain can we be? I know that we've given the trial enrolls a whole bunch of people, 33,000, like you said, but if we're only observing infections in a much smaller share of that population, how sure can we be about those numbers?
That's a really great question, Alex, because the truth of the matter is we're talking about a few hundred who got COVID-19 in these trials, right? Whereas in the United States now it's over 14.2 million documented COVID-19 cases, and that's probably an underestimate. The real number of infected individuals could be anywhere from 5 to 10 times higher than that. So it's true that we can't really capture everything about every subpopulation within this population that was recruited for phase 3 clinical trials, but they did make an effort to recruit, fairly equally by sex, different races and ethnicities, a large age range. But I will say this, we still need to do clinical trials in adolescents and young children. So this is for adults age 18 and over, but they did go all the way up until about age 85. So a fairly large range.
Trey, you're squinching your eyes like you're about to say something.
Well, no. So I'm just thinking that, so one of the big questions that I have is the adoption side of things, and when I'm thinking about these numbers in terms of, the efficacy of these vaccines and stuff, there are a lot of people that just don't think they're going to get it. So is there a way that you see this moving forward where people are more than willing to adopt or not willing to adopt? Like, because I mean, the former presidents are saying they're going to take the vaccine like on camera, right?
I think so. There have been a number of articles about them, and some people are saying, "Oh, they're skipping the line." I'm not sure I'd necessarily characterize it that way. So, Trey, that's a good question. I'm not familiar with the literature on how many people have said they will or will not get the COVID vaccine once it comes out, but I will point out that there is a potential danger with long-term, and I mean years-long consequences if not enough people are interested in receiving this COVID-19 vaccine. And a lot of it has to do with herd immunity. And we had talked about this several months ago. We are so fortunate that the vaccines that are the most likely to be approved for emergency use authorization have an incredibly high efficacy, you know, like about 95%. But that's not going to be of much help if only 50% or less of the population is interested in getting it, because that's not going to get us anywhere near herd immunity. To recap for those who hadn't heard our earlier conversation about herd immunity refers to a percentage of the population that has to either have been vaccinated for the disease or to have gotten the disease and then recovered from it, such that if this virus is circulating in the community again, it's not very likely that those individuals will get it and then transmit it to somebody else. And the herd immunity rate for each varies for each different disease depending on how contagious that disease is. So measles, for example, is highly contagious. And so you need an extremely high herd immunity, probably over 90% of people have to be vaccinated against measles in order to protect the entire population. For some other diseases, because it's not as contagious, including some strains of flu, you may need just 55% of the population to be vaccinated. With COVID-19, some of the best estimates are that herd immunity requires that between 75 to 80% of the population need to either be vaccinated or to have already, come back, acquired the disease and then acquired immunity to it.
And again, for context, what percentage of Americans have already had it, do you think?
So that is possibly an underestimate, but over 14.2 million Americans have been diagnosed with COVID-19 so far. Some of my friends and colleagues at CDC and other places say that that could be an underestimate. The real number could be between 5 to 10 times higher. So it's really hard.
Even within that number, though, there's still the question of exactly how long that immunity, even for those that have acquired it, lasts. So it's even more complicated than that, right?
It's extremely complicated, yes.
So Felicia, I'm jumping ahead. I prepared this list of questions for you, but I'm going to jump ahead because I think it relates to the stuff you're talking about now with respect to herd immunity. But I'm just curious if you could update us kind of on the scientific ideas of, do we think that COVID is going to become an endemic problem that we're living with for the rest of our lives or for a long-term issue, or is the vaccine going to be able to successfully eliminate the disease?
That's a good question, Alex. And I think that that's something that's not really known at the time being. If SARS-CoV-2 is like other coronaviruses, for example, the 4 coronaviruses that have been circulating in the human population for a long time that cause the common cold, then it's not expected that if you get the vaccine and a booster that will necessarily protect you for the rest of your life. We know that we can, for example, for the other common cold coronaviruses, we may catch them again and again throughout our lifetimes. So it's entirely possible that if SARS-CoV-2 behaves in any way similarly to these other coronaviruses, then it's quite possible that we may need more boosters in the future. And that is true of many different diseases, by the way. So for example, you probably know that you get your original tetanus shot, your primary tetanus vaccine, and then you need a booster every 10 years. You need to get a new flu vaccine depending on the strain of the flu. And that's another thing we don't know about. We don't know how likely it is that coronavirus is going to mutate, and whether this means that there will be a scramble, hopefully not every year, but possibly, to develop a new vaccine that matches that particular strain. So there are a lot of unknowns.
I guess quickly with respect to that mutation, something we talked about last week with Maria Diaz-Leon was the mink, the COVID mutation in mink. Do you have any updates on the extent to which that mutation is resistant to the current vaccines? It's
I
okay
do
if you have
not
no
have
idea about
I
that.
do not have any
Sure.
information on that because I don't think we have any data about any individuals that were specifically infected with that strain that happened to be participating in a phase 3 clinical trial.
Oh, that'd be handy though if they did.
It certainly would.
So then I guess rather than quizzing you about mink, um, can you tell us, I guess that timeline of, you said we've got 3 in this review for emergency authorization and a million others that are at various stages of the trials. What is the timeline?
Can,
Yep,
can we
go for
pump
it, Trey.
before we do that timeline? So I have read, and I'm curious if this is true, that the actual development of the vaccine was fairly quick following the pandemic outbreak. What's been taking all this time are these clinical tests. So like the actual development wasn't really the issue. It was actually trying to understand, to make sure that this is a safe vaccine for everybody to take, has been the bulk of the timeline for the last few months. Is that right? Or how does that timeline really lay out in terms of time to complete?
You're absolutely right, Trey, about that. And partly that has to do with the platform. And I think that that's something that we might want to talk about later too. That the Pfizer and the Moderna platforms are different from any vaccine that has been available to us before. They're using an mRNA vaccine, that is a messenger RNA vaccine. And I'll describe a little bit more about how that works later, but for now, to answer your question, Trey, the mRNA vaccine is relatively much quicker to develop than our typical route of using either an inactivated or an attenuated virus. That takes a very, very long time to develop. That said, there are companies that are developing that type of viral platform for coronavirus now, but it just takes much longer because you have to isolate it, you have to purify it, you have to amplify it, then you have to attenuate it or you have to inactivate it. It takes much, much longer. In the case of these mRNA vaccines, what had happened was that Chinese scientists shared the genome of SARS-CoV-2 on January the 9th of this year, of 2020. By January the 10th, Dr. Anthony Fauci was already meeting with scientists in the US to talk about, well, how can we develop a vaccine? So he was in conversation, in fact, with Moderna by that time, saying, how can we develop a vaccine now that we know the viral genome? And Moderna and Pfizer and other companies had hit upon the idea that it is possible to use or to develop messenger RNA that can specifically encode for the spike protein on the surface of the coronavirus. And probably all of you are familiar with that image of the coronavirus that has all those red spikelets coming out of it.
I'm too familiar. I feel like I've seen that stupid figure so many times.
We're all sick of seeing it, right? But basically, the corona, all of those spike proteins that are coming out of the coronavirus particle, I mean, it's those spike proteins that essentially attach to what are called ACE2 receptors on our cells. And basically, that's the method by which the coronavirus infects the cell. So what we want to do is that we want our bodies to develop antibodies that can work effectively against the spike protein of SARS-CoV-2. And that is what this mRNA vaccine is able to do, as well as the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine and then the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. They just have a slightly different platform. They're using, but what they're doing, they're viral vector vaccines, and they are using a relatively harmless adenovirus. And they are including the genetic material that will encode for the spike protein. So basically, all of these different vaccines that are at the forefront of eventual approval are targeting the spike protein of coronavirus. Trey, to get back to your point, because I did slightly go a bit more into the platforms, after January the 10th, when Dr. Fauci met with the scientists at Moderna and other scientists, it only took 63 days for Moderna to begin their phase 1 clinical trials. So that took us into March, and from March till December, yes, it has been mostly, these clinical trials that have been taking the most time.
Okay, so from a philosophical perspective, the libertarian in me says, wait, so you're telling me I could have had this vaccine in March?
Well, the vaccine had been developed at that time, but presuming that you care about the safety and the efficacy of
Yeah.
the vaccine, then absolutely we needed to have these very detailed human studies to show that. Because we're talking about something that we're hoping that many people in the United States and all over the world will be taking. It's not like other types of medications where, you have to be sick before you get it. We want to give this to everybody, even if they don't have the coronavirus. And because that is the scenario that we're dealing with, we want to make as sure as possible that the vaccines are safe and that they're effective.
I mean, I'm just trying to throw you something that like I've heard people say, right? The next thing that I've heard people say is like, okay, so let's imagine a world where we're obviously going to prioritize different people to receive the vaccine earlier than others. And so you have especially like essential laborers and hospital administrators, doctors, nurses, etc., who are likely to be getting the vaccine earlier than somebody like me who basically just lives in his house now. So in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, so maybe there is some concern, and maybe there isn't, and probably not, but maybe, that what if it backfires and all of a sudden we lose all of our doctors? Is that a concern?
It's not expected to be a concern. So you covered several different topics in that question, Trey.
Yeah.
One has to do with the timeline of when different groups of people can get the vaccine, and the other is how sure can we be safe? But can we be, how sure can we be that
Right.
this vaccine is safe so that we're not accidentally harming people who get it first? What's embedded in these phase 3 clinical trials, at least in the United States, is that we need to wait for 60 days after administration of the final booster of the vaccine to make sure that there are no adverse effects. Does this mean that there's not the possibility of longer term effects? It's certainly possible, but it hasn't usually been the case in the past when vaccines are developed that if there are no severe symptoms in the 60 days after receiving the vaccine, that there are going to be long-term effects. The short-term effects are the same as with any other vaccines. There's soreness at the injection site, possibly low-grade fever, possibly chills, things that we're all familiar with if we have had other vaccines in the past. And basically, they just show that the immune system is working, which is absolutely good news, that our bodies are working to produce the antibodies that are going to combat, the spike protein that of coronavirus. So it's not believed that the first people who will actually get this vaccine are going to be in any sort of danger. Now, if you're interested, I can talk a bit about the timeline of when different groups of people will likely get the vaccine in the United States. Okay.
Even before that, could you just clarify for me where we are in the timeline of the testing and the authorization, I guess, before we talk about the walkout of the thing post authorization?
Certainly. Pfizer filed for emergency use authorization with FDA on November the 20th, and Moderna did the same on November the 30th. FDA plans to have a consultation with its advisory committee on vaccines and related biological products on December the 10th with regard to all of the data. They're looking at all of the raw data for the Pfizer vaccine clinical trials, and they will be doing the same with the Moderna raw data on December the 17th. Now, assuming if it is the case that FDA will grant emergency use authorization for both the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines, then Pfizer has already stated that it's ready to ship out its first vaccines within 24 hours of that approval. So that is going to be sometime after December the 10th. And then with Moderna, about 24 hours to a few days afterwards. So it's all wonderful news. They have already developed a number of vaccine doses already. And the important thing to remember with both of these is that 2 doses are required. If you happen to get the Pfizer vaccine, then you get your primary booster, and then 3 weeks later, you get your primary vaccine, and then 3 weeks later, you need the booster. For the Moderna vaccine, first you get your primary shot, and then 4 weeks later, you need to get the booster.
And just out of curiosity for me, I know it seems like last week some of my buddies in England were complaining, saying, you guys in America got the vaccines first. We're going to have to wait. And then already 2 days ago, I believe, they were the first to approve the Pfizer vaccine. What's the story there about why it seems like the submission of the information to the FDA happened first here, but then maybe I think they could be criticized for looking like they're twiddling their thumbs while the British went ahead and got the approval.
Well, again, Alex, your question has multiple different parts,
Fair
and
enough.
one has to do with the availability of COVID-19 vaccines in other countries of the world, and the second has to do with what's the difference. Why did the UK approve the Pfizer vaccine when FDA in the US has not done the same? So, with regards to the first, there are already other countries in the world, including China and Russia, the United Arab Emirates, and several other countries that have already approved various vaccines for emergency use. You probably have heard about the Gamaleya Institute that has created the vaccine Sputnik 5 in Russia. That has already been approved for emergency use even before all the results of the phase 3 clinical trials had been available. Of course, now they're also saying there's 91% efficacy. They're also using a viral vector vaccine. They're using the adenovirus. China has already approved one, CanSino Bio, and the United Arab Emirates has approved use of at least 2 different Chinese vaccines already in their population. And Pfizer has already stated that with some of their initial vaccine doses, and probably with all of their vaccine doses, half will go to the United States and half will be distributed to the rest of the world. That said, it's absolutely critical to make sure that people all over the world do have access to these vaccines. And there are a number of efforts, such as Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccination and Immunization, such as the World Health Organization and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, that are working to make those vaccines more widely available worldwide. Your second question had to do with why did the UK already approve the Pfizer vaccine for emergency use, whereas the FDA hasn't? The difference, there may be several reasons. At least one difference has to do with the extent to which raw data are analyzed. The UK takes the data from the company, they review that data, and they say, okay, well, if you say, it's safe based on your statistics, we will approve it. The FDA and the independent body that works for them, the Vaccines and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee, review all of the raw data again from each of the companies, and that's tens of thousands of pages of data. So it takes them longer to really kind of look it all through, do their, check the statistics and say, well, this really does appear to be safe and it appears to be effective. That's part of the difference in the timeline.
I have so many questions about all the things you just said, but how about with respect to the fact that we're fixing to get an emergency, or hope we're fixing to get an emergency authorization? How does that differ from that standard authorization if they are in fact going through, even in the emergency authorization, going through all of the raw data themselves as the FDA?
The emergency use authorizations are on a significantly speeded up timeline. Normally, for the development of a vaccine, it can take 4 to 5 years from the time that the vaccine development begins all the way to FDA approval for widespread use of the vaccine. Here, we're talking about doing it in less than the space of 1 calendar year, which is absolutely amazing. So, and that is when there is a real public health emergency. Then these companies can apply for emergency use authorization for their medications, whether it's for vaccines, whether it's for convalescent serum, whether it's for monoclonal antibodies, all of these different treatments and prophylactics for COVID-19.
And is the review, I guess wondering, to what extent is the review less rigorous in the emergency versus kind of the standard protocols?
In this particular case for the vaccines, it's not expected to be less vigorous. The advisory committee for the FDA, VRPAC it's called for short, is very carefully reviewing all of the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 clinical data from these companies.
And how about, to get to Trey's question about zombie doctors earlier, since China and Russia and the UAE have already released some vaccines that maybe aren't exactly the same, but rely on some of the some similar mechanisms or platforms, as you called it, do we have any information about how, like, the safety of those vaccines that have already been rolled out in those countries?
That's a good question. Now we do have the many of the phase 3 clinical trial results for the Gamaleya Institute vaccine, Sputnik 5. And there, the safety record appears to be good. The efficacy looks quite good. It's 91% for an adenovirus-based vaccine. I have not been following the specific Chinese vaccines. It's interesting. They are developing vaccines with a number of different platforms. So CanSino Bio, I believe, is also an adenovirus-based vaccine. They are also developing vaccines that use protein subunits. That is, they actually contain the spike protein, not the actual virus itself. So there are some protein subunit vaccines that are being developed in China and in other parts of the world. And they are also, among other nations, developing vaccines that are based on the attenuated or the inactivated coronavirus itself.
They're still in development. They haven't been rolled out. I believe you said those take a long time to.
Those do take significantly longer, yes.
So we've got a question that came in from Facebook that, well, actually a couple questions. I'm just gonna throw them out at you so that you can knock them down. Okay, so could you speak to people's questioning about why someone needs to take a vaccine that isn't 99% effective if there is a 1% chance, give or take, of developing something serious that may lead to death? So do you even need to take the vaccine at all, because you probably aren't going to die from this anyways? That's the question.
So that's a good question. And one way that we can think about it is that the vaccines help to protect us. And in addition, they also help to protect other people. So we can think of this as that the vaccine, if we ourselves take it, will dramatically reduce our risk of becoming infected or developing COVID-19. And certainly it's very protective against severe COVID-19 infection. It really reduces the risk that we would ever have to be hospitalized or die from COVID-19. I think that, so there certainly is the protective effect that we ourselves would get, and it's not expected that there would be any safety concerns. And the US government is providing these vaccines to all of us for free. So fundamentally, there is no significant cost to us for getting the vaccine. There will be soreness at the injection site. There will be some, possibility of soreness, of fever, of chills for a day or so. The vaccines are free. We would acquire this very strong protection against a very severe infectious disease. And also, if we are vaccinated, then there is a significant likelihood that we would be much less likely, even if later infected with COVID-19, to then go on and infect other people. So there is an individual benefit and there is a community benefit.
So what I'm picking up is it's kind of like the mask thing. It's not really about you. It's about everybody that's around you. And a little bit you, but also a lot of it is about making sure that you're not passing it on to other people.
That is one significant consideration, yes, for getting a vaccine for COVID-19.
Can you just speak a little bit more about that, Felicia? Because my understanding is we're not exactly sure like the clinical trials don't test for that, the extent to which the vaccine controls or reduces spread to others. So
Hmm.
do we have good understanding about the extent to which the vaccine reduces transmission to others?
That's a great question. So that is not something that can be immediately teased out. And that is one of the uncertainties, that what we know for certain is that these vaccines for which we have phase 3 clinical trial data mean that the risk of infection is much lower. The risk of severe infection, even for those individuals who do become ill with COVID-19, is much lower. The transmissibility is somewhat less, is less clear, but it should be mentioned that, if we can avoid hospitalizations from COVID-19, especially since our healthcare system is already overwhelmed, that is an absolute good, regardless of whether it is that individuals will, not get infected or not get infected for very long, or whether they don't have symptoms.
Okay, so follow-up question from Sutan Magruder. So has there been discussion about the concern among ethnic and racial minorities in taking a vaccine, given the history of the medical community harming marginalized communities in the United States? Which I think is a fair question. I mean, you were already talking about, trying to target some of these most hit communities and here in Michigan, the most hit community, and at least in terms of mortality, is obviously Detroit, which is obviously a very ethnically unique place relative to Michigan.
Yes, that's a really important question, and I'm glad that you asked that. There is very good reason for certain minority groups in the United States to have suspicion about some of these medical experiments as well as medical procedures, because we have had a poor history. There's no other way. There's no point in sugarcoating it in terms of how different racial and ethnic groups have been treated in medical trials in the past. The Tuskegee experiment, I think, is one that most people are familiar with, where there was significant exploitation of the African American community, the trial participants there. So it is absolutely going to require some community building, some community education and outreach as far as the safety and the efficacy of this vaccine, and reasons, really explaining the benefits and the costs and the risks associated with taking the vaccine versus not taking the vaccine for these different communities.
Which, next question, which I think is very much a springboard off that question about the costs and benefits and understanding those costs and benefits. How is it that much faster this time than any other vaccine that we've developed? I mean, do we really even have a full grasp of the costs and benefits? So this is Kenda. So was this just a case of more people reviewing, more people working overtime, or what is it that really made this such a springboard vaccine as opposed to maybe other vaccines that have taken more time to develop?
Great question. In part, it has to do with the urgency of the situation. So in this particular case, we recognize this to be a global pandemic. And for the United States, at least, Operation Warp Speed actually provided $1 billion to Moderna to really
a lot of money.
But yes, so money is part of the issue, and Moderna used that money for their clinical trials, for recruitment and for developing all these different doses. That was not the case for Pfizer. Pfizer is not part of Operation Warp Speed, although they are working with Operation Warp Speed. But individually, companies as well as governments have all recognized the urgency in this particular case, because people were just falling ill. It appeared to be extremely contagious. The effects were very harmful. The hospitals were becoming overwhelmed. All of these factors put together, and the fact that this is happening on a global scale, really presented the urgency and hence the real speeding up of the vaccines. But I like your question too. I think it was Candace who asked that question, because this is our first use of mRNA vaccines. And it's been stated, well, this can actually revolutionize vaccine development in the future. So it started in this case of COVID-19, but because it's relatively much quicker to develop mRNA vaccines, this can be a wave of the future for other viruses that we encounter.
Can I ask a question which may be related to the mRNA mechanism or may not, which is I've heard that the Pfizer vaccine has to be stored in like a insanely cold environment. So I guess one, is that a result of this mRNA stuff? And two, what is the potential for problems in the distribution of this thing?
Yeah, great question. So yes, the mRNA vaccines are not stable at room temperature, certainly not for long periods of time. The Pfizer vaccine has to be stored and shipped at -70 degrees Celsius, which is -94 degrees Fahrenheit. And then once it reaches its site, it can be refrigerated for up to 5 days, and then it has to be used within those 5 days, or else it's not going to be useful anymore. The Moderna vaccine, also mRNA based, but perhaps they have a stabilizer included, can be stored and shipped for about -20 degrees Celsius. And that is, a standard freezer is, can reach that temperature. So that one might be a bit easier and more feasible for many different clinics and many different hospitals and transportation trucks to be able to achieve shipping this vaccine around the US and around the world. And that one can be stored in the refrigerator for up to 30 days. And it has to be used within 30 days. Now,
Sorry, this is a fascinating thing to me. So this was an ag policy Twitter conversation yesterday that so there has been conversation about dry ice shortages in the entire pandemic this whole time through. In one case, because people were trying to ship food in a way that they've never had to ship food before because of restaurant supply chains. So on the demand side, we had this increase in demand, and on the supply side, the production of carbon dioxide that's used for dry ice has actually dropped significantly because ethanol plants have been slowed down. And so there is this conversation, at least, that these ag supply chains are going to affect how much dry ice is available to do the shipment that you're talking about here, in terms of, especially I think the Pfizer, is that right? That Pfizer would be the one that's probably more affected. Is that a thing you think about, or do you think that we'll figure that out? It's not.
I have thought about that, and I have been worried, like you and your friends and colleagues, about the logistics of all of this. The dry ice shortage is part of it. And then there's also the logistics, making sure if people get their first vaccine, are they going to return in 3 or 4 weeks to get their second vaccine? And who's keeping a record of this? No, absolutely. And then, how long has that vaccine been sitting in the refrigerator? And is it the Pfizer one? Is it the Moderna one? I am concerned, but I trust that higher minds and mine have worked out the.
Oh no, I don't want to have to cross my fingers that there are higher minds than Felicia's working on this. Let's just put Felicia in charge of this.
No, it's going to be. It's tricky. It's so tricky. And I mean, I just have to say, we just have to wait and see what's going to happen. On that note. Can I speak a little bit about rollout? I don't know if that's
please, yeah.
Curiosity. If anybody that's listening is curious about that, like who's going to get the vaccine first, and where you might stand in line, if you're interested in getting the vaccine. It's expected. So the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, met with their advisory committee on immunization practices, which is an independent body of scientists, just this past Tuesday, so December the 1st. And by the end of that day, they had made the determination that phase 1A, that is the groups that are getting the vaccines first, once they are granted emergency use authorization, are the healthcare workers and the residents of nursing homes and assisted living facilities, those two groups. There are roughly 21 million healthcare workers in the United States and roughly 3 million nursing home residents. So they're the first 24 million or so individuals that are going to be vaccinated in the near future. Hopefully a large proportion of them even before the end of this calendar year. Now, CDC has not made any statements about who is going to be next in line, but they have been hinting at who those individuals will be. It's expected that the next group is going to be the essential workers. So, you know, per our proposal on meatpacking workers, this will include people, you know, meatpacking workers, this will include people who work in the food industry, teachers, police officers and first responders, firefighters, people who work in transportation, such as bus drivers. And the interesting thing there is that because the vaccines are going to be sent to every state proportionally to how many adults are living in states. The states get to make the determination about, you know, who is getting the vaccine. CDC gives recommendations and the states usually take the recommendations, but they can also prioritize on their own. So what every state considers as an essential worker is going to be slightly different. You know, for it'll be the meatpacking workers, it'll be people who work in agriculture. Whereas I was just reading today for Colorado, it's going to be the people who work in the ski industry that are all living together communally. You know, because the essential industries are different in different parts of the United States. And then after that group, it would be among others, you know, kind of like the next tiers would be individuals living in correctional facilities, in jails and prisons, individuals age 65 or older, and individuals who have medical conditions or risk factors that might make their COVID-19 cases more severe if they become infected. So some of those medical conditions might include COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, type 2 diabetes, obesity, heart conditions, lung conditions, or kidney conditions. And then as for everyone else, so if you are an adult age 18 or over, and you don't have any pre-existing risk factors, if you are not in one of those essential worker categories and you are not over the age of 65, then you probably expect the first vaccines for that group might be available in April. And then ideally, many adults would be vaccinated by June. Now, the clinical trials are starting for adolescents and for children. They may be vaccinated even later than that. But for most of the adult US population, hopefully by the end of the first half of 2021.
And do you have a good idea for the younger population? I think you said younger than 18. Is that what you said?
Yes.
Do you have an idea of when that stage will occur?
That is not clear right now. We don't know about that, but it'll be sometime after the adult population is vaccinated.
So side note, I don't know if you guys saw that the New York Times had a calculator that they posted last night.
Yes.
About when you would be in line for the vaccine.
Yes.
I'm very deep
in the line. I will not be getting the vaccine anytime soon.
So just to inform the audience, if you go to New York Times, you will find that they have this sort of model where they calculate when you're likely to get the vaccine. Yeah, okay, there we go.
Yeah.
Yes, and you have to enter your age, you enter whether, you know, what your profession is and the county that you live in the United States. And then they calculate how many people are in front of you in line. I did that yesterday. I'm third to last. So, I mean, everybody is ahead of me in my particular county.
I'm in line behind 268.7 million people. So yeah, I got some time. I'm not going to be getting the vaccine anytime soon.
No, that's right. And in case that's a concern to anybody who's listening, you know, are there going to be enough vaccines? So both Pfizer and Moderna have made a commitment to really ramping up production of these vaccine doses. And in addition, we have two others that are not too far behind, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. So as more of these institutions complete their phase 3 clinical trials, and if they get approval for safety and efficacy by FDA, there will be many more vaccine doses available in the coming months. And that's yet to be seen.
Felicia, can I ask you a couple questions about the logistics issues? Um, One of which I guess is, so we've got this risk that if the vaccine isn't stored properly, that it may lose efficacy. Will we know beforehand that that specific vaccine is not efficacious, or is there the risk that there will be someone who's injected just with like a placebo, essentially?
That would be a really terrible scenario. And um, it's not expected that, certainly not the person who received the vaccine. It's not, I don't think that that individual can necessarily tell whether they are getting an effective vaccine or not because of problems related to storage. I will say this, which is quite interesting. You know about some of the controversies that arose with regard to the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine?
Yeah, sure.
That in part, that was determined because some of the individuals that had been injected with a half dose were saying, I don't feel that sick. I'm not really
Mm.
experiencing any of these symptoms. So they actually did notice that they did not have, all of these, the fever, the chills, etc. So they were wondering about it. And then it was later found out that they received a half dose as their primary vaccine. So there may be some awareness, perhaps if you don't develop any symptoms after being injected, you might question.
Well, how about the other way around? Is there a concern about safety if the vaccine becomes improperly stored, or is that not a risk?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. It's not expected that there would be a risk, but I don't think anybody knows that.
So we've got another question from Facebook, from Jeanette Woodard, and honestly, I don't know
Hello,
anything
Jeanette.
about this one. So Jeanette is do these vaccines require eggs like the regular flu vaccine? I didn't even know the flu vaccine required eggs.
Okay, yes. So eggs have been one medium of to part of the vector for the vaccine in the past. They are not required in this particular case. I think, Jeanette, you might be referring to the albumin that had been used in the past to deliver the vaccine. No, eggs are not part of this. I know that that was, at least for a time, a concern, particularly for people who are allergic to eggs. That's not a concern for these vaccines.
And how about, so you mentioned that amongst the first round of people who will be um, inoculated or vaccinated will be the elderly. I believe I've heard risks earlier on that they're the least likely to be immunoresponsive. So they're kind of a big risk group that even if we vaccinate them, they might still not develop that immunity. Is that a risk that has been resolved, or is that still a continuing risk?
That's a good question. And I think that, so I can tell you what the phase 3 clinical trials or how they were designed, and also the controversy that your exact question still poses. The Pfizer vaccine trials involve people up to the age of 85. I think for the Moderna vaccine, they just specified, age 60 and above. And then the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, when they released their press release, they even said this is especially efficacious in people over the age of 65. So older populations were involved in all of these clinical trials. They were included, and we don't have any reason to believe that the vaccine was less effective in them than it was in other individuals. That said, what is known is that when I mentioned earlier that CDC met with their advisory committee on immunization practices on Tuesday, it was not a unanimous vote for who phase 1A was going to be. There was one dissenting vote, and that one dissenter specifically raised the question that you just mentioned now, which is, does it make sense to vaccinate people in nursing homes, because is there any risk that the vaccine is less effective in them? So this individual had raised that concern. And the phase 3 clinical trials, they didn't seem to show that there was any lower efficacy in elderly populations, but this was something that somebody who's very expert in the area of infectious diseases and immunology did raise.
Okay, so let me just throw out more of a broad question. When are we going to go back to normal? Do you like okay, so we get this vaccine and like maybe I get it in June or whatever, or whenever I get it, does that mean I can just go back to being my normal self, like my 2018 self, minus 20 pounds or plus 20 pounds? I don't know.
I think while there's still a great deal of uncertainty as to your question, I think the answer is we are going to have to be careful for a very long time. And I think that there's many different factors that we don't know yet that play into my very cautionary take on this, which is that we don't know how many people would be willing to get the vaccine. We also don't know, and this was a point that either you, Trey, or Alex, you raised, which is that we also are not 100% certain about whether getting this vaccine means that we would just immediately kill off the virus if we should be infected, or we are simply asymptomatic and we can still transmit. So, and plus there's also the factor of all our kids, right? So, and, you know, we're beginning the clinical trial, you know, much more widespread clinical trials in the younger population. So the question is, when will the schools feel free to completely open up? And all over the state, all over the United States, every school district has slightly different rules anyway. I think because of all of this uncertainty and variability, Trey, I'm afraid, I don't know that you can go back to 2018 self, you know, necessarily by June. It will depend on a lot of factors that remain to be seen in this next half year.
Well, that's sad.
And with that,
so Bailey Norwood made the comment. He said, "Let's just all agree we don't want to lose the weight that we gained in the last 8 months."
Well, what I want
so long as I can keep this weight.
I don't want to end on a negative note at all. I think that the news of the vaccines, and especially of their efficacy in COVID-19 infection and risk, it's all very, very good news. And I think that the safety profile has been quite good as well. It appears to be somewhat likely, you know, I'm thinking it's probably quite likely that FDA will grant emergency use authorization of these two vaccines. That will remain to be seen on December the 10th and December the 17th for the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines respectively. We, you know, there are still so many uncertainties, but so far it appears to be all very good news that the end is in sight for this kind of horrific situation that we've been living in much of 2020 so far. The end is likely to be in sight.
Let's cut it off there before we raise any caveats to that. Felicia, thank you so much. It is just always wonderful when you come on to have somebody that actually knows stuff rather than having to listen to Trey the whole time.
And just to highlight how great it is. So from Facebook, Kenneth says, "You're a very well-spoken and knowledgeable speaker. Nice to have information from an expert." I'm pretty sure that's a dig at Alex and I, because that's one of our regular listeners. So thank you for joining.
Well, thank you both very much, and thank you to all the listeners. Let's just keep hanging in there. You know, just stay safe when the vaccines come out. I think that will really change the picture of things, and I wish you all happy holidays for this month to come.
Thank you. You
Stay
too.
safe.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Gonna go enjoy my 13-foot Christmas tree.
That's right.
Bye, guys.
Okay. Bye-bye.